What's up, YouTube? Last time out, I showed you my games from rounds 1 and 2 of the 5th 4NCL Online Congress. I won them both, so let's dive right into rounds 3 to 5 to see if I can win my first chess tournament in 5 years. Alright, so it's round 3. I am 2 out of 2. I'm playing black against Ringo01, so let's see what happened. My opponent opened the game with e4. I played c5, as I always do, the Sicilian defense, and after d4, cd4, and c3, we have the Smith-Morra gambit. So this gambit is considered generally, in theory, to be quite harmless. If black really wants, he can just transpose to the Alpin by knight f6, e5, knight d5, and after c takes d, we have a line of the Alpin where black is already equal. Black has already equalized in this position. So you know, this is a very worst case. You can just do this. But I'm not here to transpose to the Alpin and decline gambits. I'm here to refute them. So I took on c3. We got knight takes c3, of course the point, knight c6, knight f3, d6, trying to develop the bishop. And here the main move for white is bishop c4, and I'll put some more things on the board, so I plan to play bishop b4 here. And after castles, knight e7, queen e2, castles, and rook d1. We have quite a standard Smith-Morra position where the rook is x-raying the queen, e5 is potentially in the air, just cramping black's position. But black is objectively fine here. There's some pressure, some compensation, but black has an extra pawn, and the compensation is typically not sufficient. However, my opponent didn't play bishop c4, my opponent played bishop e2. And this, to me, was extremely strange. So I actually asked him after the game if this was a mouse slip, and he said no, he just misremembered his lines, and I just don't know how you can ever think that bishop e2 is correct, to be honest with you. Like, even if you think you remember this, it's just a really passive move, right? It just looks at this knight, it's not an active square, and remember, white is down a pawn. White has to play actively, try and restrict d5, try and restrict black's pieces. Sorry about that. So bishop e2 doesn't really make any sense to me, and after this, you know, black should already be much better. So bishop b4, as I'd planned anyway. I didn't see any reason to already play this, and actually my opponent played bishop c4 on the very next move. So we have the same position, except white has lost the tempo, and in these kinds of gambit structures, that's typically quite important. So I just continued as normal. I couldn't see any immediate way to punish it, so I just played knight e7, castles, and here, you know, black is comfortably better here. We have the extra pawn. The queen is not an e2, as it would be normally, so rook d1 is not coming immediately. And actually, you know, after queen e2, knight g6, bishop b3, there's just some normal moves. b6, rook f to d1, and bishop b7. Black has, you know, successfully developed all his pieces. Queen c7, rook d8, and d5 is coming, and black should have absolutely no problems here. And the computer agrees. The computer gives this as a very big advantage for black already. And the same if you begin with bishop e3, it just transposes after knight e6, and then queen e2, b6, and bishop b7, and black is more than fine. Black is doing excellently here. Now, I've already shown you what happens after queen e2 or bishop e3, normal moves. Here my opponent compounded his problems by playing another really strange move. So here he played knight h4, which doesn't develop a piece, completely abandons the center, and kind of doesn't accomplish anything, right? Like, what is this knight doing? Both of these squares are really well covered by my knight and my pawns. So I'm not really sure what the point of this knight h4 move was, but I'm not convinced by it, and I was unconvinced enough by it that I thought this allowed me to immediately play d5. Which, as it turns out, I could, and this is already overwhelmingly almost winning for black now after knight h4, d5. So we have ed5, knight d5, and queen g4. So I guess my opponent thinks their point is that they're going to try and come and kill me on the king side. Now I've played d5. You know, there's a case, I guess, that my king is a little devoid of defenders. My f6 knight is now on d5. The bishop is on b4. And maybe he's trying to make a case that the position is overextended. But I don't think this can ever really be the case. For one, this knight is already hanging, not for a piece, but once I take, if you just recapture, then I will just take the pawn and the upper clean pawn, and I will actually also take take the pawn with tempo on the rook. So you have to play rook b1, and then, well, yeah, b6, bishop b7, and at some point I will play bishop f6, and now my king side is well defended. So this was kind of the point. Instead, my opponent, potentially out of desperation, played bishop h6, threatening checkmate on g7, but this is a superficial threat. Queen f6, which is what I played in the game, comfortably defends. Attacks the bishop. You still need to recapture my knight, so this is effectively a double attack. At some point, the knight on h4 might be under attack as well, although it already was from d8. So, but this is still relevant because the queen looks at these two pieces and kind of comfortably defends the king side by itself. This bishop is not participating in the attack, and neither are the other two rooks that are home. So this can never really ever be good for white, and you have to deal immediately with the problem that you need to recapture this knight, and also this bishop is hanging. So these are my set of ideas. In fact, I had something even stronger here. Instead of playing queen f6, it was much stronger for me to play queen d4, which accomplishes all these things, and I'll go to f6 in a second, but actually first it forces white to avoid a trade of queens. If white trades queens here, white has absolutely nothing. Like, absolutely zero. But actually, as it transpires, you have to take the queen, because if you go away off the g-file, you're no longer threatening checkmate, so I can just take this, and this is just a piece. Currently black is up 2 pieces, but you will recapture straight away, but this is still a piece. And whether the queen goes to g3 or g5, on the g-file is the same move, knight to e4, removing this knight from the attack with tempo, and this is also just a piece. So actually it transpires that white's best move is just to take the queen, and after queen takes queen, knight takes queen, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn. This is just a pawn at the moment. We still have a double attack, so the bishop on h6 is hanging, the rook on a1 is hanging. If you try and counter-attack, there is b5. Again, renewing the double attack. So if you take this, I will just take the bishop, and actually there is nothing better. If you go away with the bishop, say to d3, then I'll just play b4 and solidify the bishop. And here black should easily win with the 2 extra pawns, with the more active minor pieces. The bishop's still hanging on h6, bishop b7 will come next. Yeah, black should easily win here. So that was after queen d4 rather than queen f6. And I guess there's 2 lessons here that I've written in the sidebar that I'll show you now. So the first one is to always check threats and forcing move first, like queen d4. This is good advice in general, and even when you don't think you're winning material as you are here, but yeah, always a good thing to do and a good thing to remind yourself. And the second one is to not switch off when you think you're winning. So here I'm like, well, I'm already up a pawn, white doesn't really have an attack, I'm winning a second pawn, and maybe I just switched off a bit and played queen f6 without really considering what the absolute best move was. And then you can get punished for that later if you don't play the best moves and kill the game off now. So really, I should have stopped for a minute, and I had plenty of time and stopped and played queen d4. But okay, let's continue with the game. So my opponent played b takes c3 here, and I made another mistake here actually. Here I played bishop takes c3, the natural looking move, attacking the rook, and the bishop on h6 is still hanging. Though of course here, rook ac1 comes, and then I took on h6. But actually, a bishop takes c3, there's a much stronger move, and that's bishop e7. And now this really is a double attack. I'm threatening to take this bishop, and I'm also threatening to take this knight. And as it turns out, you can't defend both. You either move the bishop away, and I take the knight, or you move the knight back to f3, and I take the bishop, or you take g7, and I take the bishop anyway. So this is, yeah, winning a piece and totally winning, as opposed to bishop takes c3, where we have rook ac1, queen h6, and rook takes c3, and okay, I've won another pawn, and this should be still winning for black, but isn't nearly as good. It's not a whole piece. So, this thing about don't switch off if you're winning, that's 2 tactical opportunities and 2 moves I had to just kill the game off completely, and I didn't. So we'll see what happens from here. So here instead, I went into let's trade things off and don't blunder anything, and then let my 2 extra pawns win the game, which theoretically should be enough, but sometimes is easier said than done. So let's see what happened. I played knight e5, forking the queen and bishop, just trading off a pair of pieces, queen e4, taking the bishop on c4. rook takes c4, and then I take queen d2, attacking the a2 pawn. We have a4 by white, and queen d5, saying I've centralized my queen, I'd quite like to trade them. I'm 2 pawns up. White, of course, declines, plays queen g4, and here, actually, despite my earlier mode, I do blunder something. So here I played e5, attacking the queen. And I've highlighted these 2 pieces because actually it's quite amazing. It looks like that most of white's pieces are completely out of the game here, and white shouldn't really have a tactic. So again, I didn't even think about it too much. But it turns out white's got something quite amazing here that will give white a completely winning position. So if you'd like to pause the video and see if you can find how to get a completely winning position for white, then go ahead and I'll give you a few seconds. So for those of you who are able to find it, congratulations for winning the game. And if you just want to see what happened, the idea is rook takes c8. So here after rook c8, you have to take. And the defender of the f5 square has been removed. You saw the arrow on the previous move there. So knight f5, and this threatens both queen g7 checkmate and also knight e7 check picking up the queen. And either of these things will obviously be completely winning for white. So you have to defend against both of them, and actually it's not really possible to satisfactorily do so. So king f8 is the best that black has, trying to cover the e7 square this way, and also saying, okay, have this pawn, but it's not checkmate, so white will take. And after king e8, white is completely winning. I've drawn the arrows to illustrate the ideas. Queen f6 here, and the threat is queen e7 checkmate again. And you can't really defend against this. If rook c7, then queen h8 check, and after king d8, you take the rook, and that'll be winning for white. If you try and defend with the queen on d7, actually queen h8 is checkmate. You've kind of cut your own king's escape route. And if queen to e6, then not trading queens, but knight g7 check, picking up the queen, and with it the game. So this is an opportunity for my opponent to mount a quite stunning comeback, really. Not easy to spot. I missed it, so did he. He actually played queen e2 here. And we breathe a sigh of relief as I've got away with one. I played bishop e6, attacking the rook. He saw it. He did not allow me to take his rook, and played rook e4. And actually, this is also quite an annoying move. White has some quite annoying pressure on the position here. This e5 pawn is a little bit loose. And actually, the ways to defend it are not so clear, because if at f6, I'm a bit concerned about f4, basically, but I didn't see anything better, so I played f6. And here, rather than play f4 immediately, my opponent made a good move, played rook to d1, attacking the queen and forcing it to move, so I played queen c6, and then f4. And actually, this is not so straightforward for black anymore, because the pawn is pinned. I can't take it because I dropped the bishop on e6. So I have to figure out what exactly I want to do here. But it's worth noting here, before we see how I attempt to defend this, that my opponent is doing the right things. I have ended up low on the clock again. We'll see why this creates some more problems in a minute, but given that I'm low on the clock, my opponent is taking the position where they're probably objectively lost and making it complicated and increasing the chances that I blunder. So they're doing the right things here. So I defended the pawn with rook a to d8. So this defends it tactically, because if you take, then I take on d1, and after you recapture, the rook on e4 hangs. So you can't immediately take the pawn, so my opponent instead took on d8, and then played h3. Now here I opted to try and trade the pawns to relieve some of the pressure, so I saw a quick calculation, so queen c1. Here you can play queen e1. But after this trade, this position should be much easier for black to consolidate than the previous one with queens on the board. So you don't really want to trade queens when you're material down, right? So instead he played king h2. I played f5, deflecting the rook away from the 4th rank, and after he took the e5 pawn, which I didn't think I could defend anyway, so quite happy to trade it for this f4 pawn with check. He played g3, opting to do this instead of allowing me to play queen c1 with check again and maybe bring the rook into the 2nd rank. So I played queen c1 here, threatening rook d2 anyway. Oh, if I can do my arrows correctly. So my opponent played knight f3, defending this square. And I played bishop f7, which actually just drops the f5 pawn. So this is first instance of time trouble does you wrong here. So I made this move very, very quickly without seeing that at the end the f5 pawn is hanging. And I don't really have an answer for it. And it comes to a head very quickly again, actually, after rook f5, bishop d5. I played this just trying to put pressure and saying, surely, white is getting checkmated if I can trade this knight. But actually, I just blundered rook takes d5. And the point is, I can't recapture because there's queen e8 checkmate. Lesson 3, Sam. Manage the clock. I've done this like 3 or 4 times now, and sometimes I get away with it, and sometimes I don't. But here, it cost me a completely winning position right from the opening. Like I said, my opponents did the right things, made it complicated for me, made it difficult, and I blundered in time trouble. So I resigned here and moved to 2 out of 3. A frustrating one to lose for sure. I think having a good attitude is important. It would be quite easy here for me to just say, I blundered and it's time trouble, and it can happen to anyone. But I think that the previous games and the previous analyses on the channel show that this is a bit of a recurring theme for me, and so I should identify the things I could do better and learn something from it. The fact I had a winning position out of the opening doesn't really matter. What matters is the final result and the things you can improve. So, okay, 2 out of 3. It'll be quite difficult for me to win the tournament from here. There are something like 70 players and only 5 rounds, so just by mathematics, I need a fair few results to go my way, a fair few draws between people ahead of me. But all I can do is try and win my final 2 games, and we'll go from there. Alright, we're back in the room. It's round 4. I have white. We're playing against Parking Peahen. c4, f5, knight f3, d6, and d4. We get a Dutch defense, and after e6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, knight f6, castles, castles, b3, and queen e8. All these moves have been played many, many times before. This is a standard setup against the Dutch. White's going to put the bishop on the long diagonal, as they do here, bishop b2, knight b7. Here, this is the first deviation from what's considered kind of the main line theory of this setup for white. So normally, white here plays queen h5, and after knight d2 or knight c3, knight c6, e3, bishop d7. Both sides have pretty much finished their development. White will play queen c2 shortly, or queen e2, and connect the rooks, and we'll have quite a sharp game where black will try and push some pawns and try and create some play on the king side, as suggested by the position of the queen and where the bishop's pointing. And we'll have quite a sharp game. But here my opponent played knight b to d7 instead. Perhaps a little bit more passive, but by no means a major mistake. I played knight d2 anyway, as I had planned. And then my opponent played bishop d8. Very strange. Very, very strange. Black has essentially undeveloped this bishop. It still looks down the same diagonal, but it's much less active on the square. It prevents the rooks from being connected. And you've got a few issues here as black, really. So you kind of have to ask the question of yourself, okay, well, what's black's plan here? And the only thing I could think of, really, was that black was revealing the queen to try and play e5, which is a typical idea for black in these kinds of structures, but not if you haven't finished your development yet. So how am I going to meet this? Okay, I played rook e1, and my idea is to meet e5 with e4, and say, okay, you can play e5. We could open the position if you want, but that's going to benefit me as I'm better developed. I mean, look at this. All of black's pieces are having a slumber party. They're having a sleepover on the back rank or near the back rank, near their homes. You can't play like this. And so I endeavoured to prove this. My opponent, as I expected, played e5, and I went e4. And after f4, de5, de5, gf4, ef4, note that, okay, this has opened the g file in front of my king, but really, like, what are black's pieces doing about it at the moment? Nothing. e5, creating the e4 square to activate my knight. Knight g4, h3, kicking the knight back to h6, a horrible square. It can't go anywhere else. And then knight e4, white has got an incredibly pleasant position. Pieces are much better developed. I have the open d file for the queen and for the rook soon. And black has no attack. This pawn is arguably overextended, and if anything, it's black king that's weak after queen d5 shortly. So really, it's to be honest, quite horrible and it all went wrong with this bishop d8 move. Here, black should play knight b6 or queen h5 or something that tries to develop a piece. This bishop d8 can only be classed as a big mistake. Yeah, and after the opening of the position, we see that, as usual, the opening of the position benefits the player with a better development. So after knight e4, white is just much better, and actually it's really hard to find a move for black. It's really difficult to untangle. Like just sit here, pause the video, and try and find a move to help black untangle, to try and get these pieces developed on the back rank. It's actually really hard. And so my opponent tried knight b6. I just played c5. Just go back. You're not allowed to go there. And there's nothing better. You have to go back. And after that, white just essentially gained a tempo to push the pawn and develop the queen. Queen d5, check, king h8. And white is even stronger than after knight e4 here. So this game is a healthy reminder to all of us for lesson 1 of the game, which is not to neglect your development. And to be honest, all I've got to say is if you don't understand why, then go watch the last 5 minutes again. But of course, it wouldn't be me playing if I didn't immediately try and give the advantage away. So here I played knight f to g5, trying to look at something on the f7 square. However, it's quite well defended and this doesn't create an immediate threat. So it actually allows black to gain some tempo and untangle a little bit. So black played c6. After queen d4, there's knight f5, bringing the knight away from the rim. Queen c3 and queen g6 attacking the knight. Now the knight is attacked twice and only defended once. So I had to play knight f3. And all of a sudden, okay, black's bishops are still on the back rank, but this doesn't look so horrible anymore. Here, there is actually a way for black to untangle immediately, although it's quite hard to find. Here, if you play knight b8, then after a normal developing move for white, say rook a to d1, there's bishop e6, and suddenly actually these bishops are a little bit more open. We managed to develop this one, the knight can come back to d7, and black is still worse, but should be doing kind of okay here. But for a human, this is incredibly hard to find because it's, okay, you're trying to untangle by undeveloping one of the only pieces that you currently have developed, and it's not at all clear that you're going to have time to do that. So my opponent played knight h4 instead, which attacks g2. I basically have to take it. And then after bishop h4, my opponent then basically claims, okay, at least I managed to develop this piece. And actually, there's still some quite strong threats here. f3 is potentially a problem, and this bishop looks at f2, as well as the bishop being pinned. And I didn't like the look very much, to be honest, now that everything's off the f-file of f3 when the bishop is pinned to the king. So I played king f1, just essentially getting out of the pin and trying to hide the king away from the attack a little bit. But as it turns out, my opponent can actually play f3 anyway, even though the bishop isn't pinned, because after bishop f3 there's a distraction tactic. Knight takes c5, which deflects the queen away from the defense of the bishop. And if you take with the knight instead, there's actually bishop takes h3 check. And this, we're going to have a king hunt, essentially. I won't go through the details here, but suffice to say, this is now, with these bishops developed and the rook ticking down here, this is a winning attack for black. So actually, king f1 is a big mistake, and actually doesn't really defend against the threat of f3 at all. So I was quite lucky that my opponent played queen f5 here, which actually blunders the advantage back to white by just not finding this f3 move. Here I played knight d6, attacking the queen, which is fine but slightly inaccurate. Actually, even stronger was e6 first. Sorry about that. So queen f5 and e6. Actually, after knight f6, knight d6 now is even stronger, because after knight d6 in the game, the queen can hide on e6, but after e6, knight f6, knight d6, you can't hide there anymore, because the rook looks down the e-file and the pawn is in the way. So actually, after queen g6 and e7, white will win the house here. There's no way to stop white winning some material after this. So e6 wins immediately, but knight d6 also secures a nice advantage. We have queen e6, as I already said. And here I intended to play rook e4, attacking the f4 pawn. Of course it is defended, but just adding some pressure. Eventually I might double down the e-file as well, or rook lift if this pawn eventually moves. I am also x-raying the bishop, which is not totally irrelevant in the case of f3. But actually I played rook e2, which is a horrible blunder. This is a complete mouse slip. I intended to play rook e4, but actually this gives black another opportunity to play the same thing again. Knight takes c5, and after queen c5, f3, walking these two pieces. And as before, black will get a hugely strong attack after this as well. So another opportunity to punish, in this case, my mouse slip rather than my bad move as intended. But my opponent played rook d8 instead. Not really sure why, to be honest. Okay, this file is technically open, but this knight is very solidly on this square. You are not going to remove this. So now I played rook e4 as planned. Initially just down a tempo, and we have bishop g5 defending the f4 pawn. It did actually need defending because the rook had moved from the f8 square. And here I played h4. This is a nice move. Essentially, the point being that you can't really take it because it takes on f4, and this will be absolutely crushing for white. The bishop is attacked. The rook now looks down the f file. The queen is coming in. Maybe not to this square in particular. And bishop h3 is coming. So you can't take it. But so bishop h6. Now rook d1, just bringing the queen's rook into the game. King g8. So there are some issues here, basically with black trying to untangle with the back rank. So my opponent, I think, is just trying to bring the king out of the corner to try and help. You don't want to play g6 with this battery looking down. Sorry, with this battery looking down here. So my opponent is just trying to bring the king out of trouble, but actually bishop h3 is absolutely crushing for white again. This is what I played. Again, just making my pieces more active, and black is still tangled up, basically. So we have queen e7, knight f5, attacking both the queen and the bishop, and after queen e8, this is not a particularly pleasant square for the queen, but really there is absolutely nothing better. The only other places are f8 and f7, and f7 is not possible because of e6 immediately. Blocking these, the knight is defended, you can't take this, and white will win the house. And queen f8 doesn't really help either. It's queen e8, queen f8 seems to be much the same. So after queen e8, we have knight takes h6 check, g takes h6, the king is exposed, and e6. And this is a vivid image. Right, this is absolutely white threatens checkmate on two different squares, on g7 and h8. The knight is attacked, and the only way to get it is actually move the knight out of the way and go to f6. But then actually white has checkmate here. So actually if you just take, sorry, this is what I played in the game, but if you just take, actually there's no way to prevent all the checkmate threats. Black will have a few distractions, but this will be checkmate in a few moves. But there are all kinds of ways to win. So I played rook takes d8 instead. After queen takes d8, I just took the knight. It's just saying this is just a piece, and now you are essentially forced to trade the queens off. Of course, this is not checkmate, but it should still win. So queen f6, bishop f6. And b6, which attacks c5. Okay, so let's take some stock of what's happened over the sort of chaos of the last 10-15 moves. Well, now white is up a piece and completely winning. In fact, but actually only after black has missed a couple of opportunities. So lesson 2 is to be careful of your king safety, because every opportunity that black had was related to the lack of safety of my king on f1. And to do with bringing the bishops over to the king's side with tempo and getting a winning attack. So be careful of the king safety. On this occasion, I got away with it, but it's something to take away from this. So okay, we continue. Bishop g2. This does two things. It x-rays the pawn on c6 and the rook on a8. It also gets the bishop off this diagonal so that I can push the pawn without dropping the bishop with check. So bishop g2, my opponent took on c5, and I played e7, threatening to promote. The rest, this is just a piece, and black's structure is horrendous, with pawn islands and double pawns everywhere. So the rest is just a matter of technique. I won't show it in a huge amount of detail, but there is one more key moment, and that's right here, where white's still up a piece, the bishop is hanging, but actually white has a good simplification tactic here, which will just end the game from any practical perspective here. So I played rook d7, and rook d7, sacrificing the exchange. Okay, well, what's the point? The point is e8 queen, black has to take, or you're just up a queen, and then bishop c6, which pins the rook to the queen, rook to the king rather, and as soon as black tries to move away, white will just take this rook and be up a clean bishop. So we see that a6 was played, and here I don't take the rook because I don't have to. The rook is still pinned, it's not going anywhere, so I just play king e2, and I would just continue bringing the king if black continued delaying moving the king out of the way, but here black played king f7, and after bishop takes d7, king takes f6, this is just a clean bishop. So this really helped me simplify the game, and brings us to lesson 3, which is to look for simplifications when you're ahead. This position, in both I'm up a piece, but this position is much easier to win than one where I have to deal with a rook. So this simplification tactic really helped, and there are some further moves in the game, but really it just consists of me mopping up all of black's pawns, and eventually my opponent resigned. So I moved to 3 out of 4. With a chaotic game where I got another winning opening advantage, which I contrived to throw away again. Luckily my opponent didn't spot them. So yeah, 3 out of 4, and I'll see you back for round 5. And boom, we're back in the room for round 5. Black versus Barney Storm. I really need to win to have any chance of any prize at all, let alone winning the thing. So let's see what happens. So my opponent had the white pieces, and we ended up with, via a slightly different move order, a mainline King's Indian. I played e5, and my opponent opted for this setup with d5. So what happens here is, well, okay, so normally the main move here is castles, and then only after knight c6, d5, and pushing the knight back to e7. By doing this, my opponent closes the center immediately and denies me the opportunity of taking on d4 and going into those lines. But defining the center this early comes at a cost, and it's usually to do with the c5 square and some easier play for black around what to do in terms of attacking e4. You usually end up with a knight here, and you have some pressure. You'll play f5 and attack it this way as well. If I can draw arrows, which I apparently can't tonight. So what do I do about this? Well, the main move here is a5, and that's what I played. So the point is that I'm going to play knight a7, knight a6 to c5, and I don't want b4 kicking the knight away. Here my opponent castled, and this is not the most popular move in this position, and we'll see why. So white only scores about 40% from here, which is not good. Here the most normal move and what's played most often is bishop g5. So pinning this knight has a couple of purposes. You develop the bishop, but mostly you're trying to prevent black's natural plan of knight e7 and f5. This is a lot harder now because the knight is pinned, and actually the normal looking page 6, which is quite often played, doesn't do too much yet, because bishop h4, and then just to give a few moves, knight a6 is usually played, knight d2, and then queen e8 getting out of the pin. But then white's argument is somewhat that this queen is misplaced. From d8 after f5 it can come out to the king side quite easily, and from e8 that's much more difficult now. You have to play f5 and g5 before you ever get this in. So bishop g5 being the most popular move here, but my opponent played castles. We have knight a6, a3. Note that actually this doesn't threaten b4 yet, because after knight c5, as is played in the game, if b4 immediately and takes, this rook on a1 hangs. So white can't play b4 immediately, so that's why I just played plunk my knight on c5 anyway. I'm building some pressure on e4. And now bishop g5 was played a few moves later. So we got there eventually, but it's a bit less effective here. As black has some pressure already on e4 and can continue playing on the queen side. So I played a4 here, and so basically my idea here is that b4 can now never happen, because after b4 I just take en passant. The knight will stay on c5 forever, unless you want to take it with this bishop, but it seems a weird spot to do that. And now the a3 pawn is weak. So a4, a pretty normal idea in these kinds of positions, and certainly a good one for black usually. Knight d2 by white, just over defending the e4 square. h6, and now white normally goes back to h4 and says, if you want to play g5, then I'll happily come here, but that makes it harder to play f5, because after f5, black typically wants to take with the g-pawn to increase the control of e4. Obviously, you can't do that if the pawn is already on g5. So bishop h4 is typically considered a bit more stubborn. My opponent went back to e3 instead, which is a bit inaccurate, but not the end of the world. And so I continue with the normal King's Indian plan and played knight f to d7. Note here that knight h5 is particularly not good. White will just take and then take the pawn with the queen, and the king will be opened. So it won't be so good for black. Even without this typical tactic, sometimes when the knight's on f3, you can't play knight h5, even though it's blocked, because knight takes e5 is a tactic, revealing an attack on the knight. But here, yeah, you can't play this in any case right now. So knight f d7 instead. This also has another advantage of solidifying the knight on c5. So in case white takes, you can take back with the knight, which isn't that important. Like, you don't have to be able to take back with the knight, but it is helpful. It keeps some pressure on e4. So yeah, here mostly though I'm going for f5. So my opponent played g4. A very committal move, but a move with a very obvious point. You're trying to prevent me going f5. This, however, does leave some weak squares behind. So I tried to exploit this immediately by starting kind of the attack and went queen h4. Interestingly, that this approach is not computer approved, and maybe we'll see why over the next few moves. The engine line here, I will confess to not really understanding in many ways, but I guess in some ways it has some logic. It just seems really slow. So here the engine line goes like king h7 and then rook b1, queen e7, king h1, bishop f6, knight back to f3 for white, and rook h8. So I guess here you're trying to build the attack down the h file. Although it's not entirely clear to me after bishop f6 what you're doing with this knight. If you're going over to b6, then you're kind of bringing it away from the queen side. So I probably need to look at this in a little bit more depth. But yeah, so my attempt not engine approved. But to be honest with you, no idea what the engine is trying to do here. So I played queen h4, just trying to exploit some of these holes. And actually had king h1. This is a great move by my opponent. This is engine approved. Basically, the idea being that now he's cleared the g file to bring the rook to help with some defense, eventually maybe on g2, or if I ever open the g file, then it will be looking straight down at my king. So this is a great move, very impressive. And here, basically, I played f5, trying to say, okay, you've left loads of weaknesses behind by playing g4, and I'm just going to bust the position open. And maybe now, I guess we'll see why this is not engine approved. My opponent played knight f3. This, interestingly, I think he had something better immediately. So actually, the immediate takes looks absolutely crushing for white. So if you take and take and take, now the immediate rook takes f5 doesn't look great at all. Rook g1, attacking down the g file. And then, for example, just to play some moves, it's just e4, just for argument's sake. Obviously you can take this, but just to see what happens, rook g3, knight e5, and queen g1, and actually white's just going to play queen g2, rook a to g1, and kill black down the e file. You just can't stop this. It's not literally there is nothing you can do. Feel free to set this position up and try. That I've tried. I've checked with the engine. There is absolutely nothing that black can do here, even though the attack seems really slow. I didn't even consider this in the game because I just thought, no, there's no way something like this will work. But this is completely winning for white. So you can't take after takes and takes f5. So you have to play knight f6. And after rook g1, bishop takes f5, which is slightly less clear, but the engine still gives this as +3, +4 with the same plan. So, yeah, just the immediate takes actually. I guess this idea of attacking white at arguably their strongest point is probably not a great idea. But thankfully my opponent didn't do that. My opponent played knight back to f3. And so I have two choices. I can drop back to e7, or I can double down and play queen h3. If you drop back to e7, then this is an okay move, and you just kind of continue. Here, interestingly, the plan of taking doesn't work so well anymore. After knight f6, rook g1, because the queen is defending the bishop now, and that makes a big difference. So queen e7 was a move. I played queen h3, but actually have to back out of this quite quickly. So my opponent played rook g1, and the threat here actually is bishop f1, which traps the queen. And I didn't see this before rook g1 was played, so now I have to think about what to do. And there are kind of three moves you can do to try and clear some space on the king's side, and only one of them works. So you can try f4, but then just bishop f1, and the queen is trapped. You can take on e4. So the idea is now that after bishop f1, there is queen takes f3. But here instead, not bishop f1, but rook g3, and the queen is trapped. And so actually the only move that doesn't immediately lose the queen is f takes g4. Which is what I played, and my opponent played rook g3 anyway. So the point here is obviously I've cleared the h5 square where there was a white pawn before. So I played queen h5, knight d2, getting out of the way, knight to f6. Just now, basically by doing this, I've won a pawn, and white can take back whenever they like. But here I've added quite a lot of artillery to try and defend this. My opponent took the knight on c5 at this point to try and, I guess, like untangle his pieces from the defense of e4. But giving up the bishop pair doing so, and now an idea for black has to be long term to activate this bishop, because after takes this bishop no longer has an opponent, and so if black ever activates this bishop, particularly down the long diagonal, it should be very, very good for black. So bear this in mind. It'll come up later. But now the activation of this bishop has to be a long-term goal for black. So my opponent played knight takes a4. The a4 pawn is now slightly weak, so snaps it off. I played queen h4. The queen isn't really doing anything on h5 anymore. Actually, and if this knight ever moves, this is a better route back. There are no now that black has a pawn on g4 as well, but there's no risk of knight f3 trapping the queen. So this is just moving the queen to a slightly more active square. My opponent took the second pawn on c5, and I played knight h5. So this was my idea. I was basically claiming that you can't take this because of exactly what happened in the game. Actually, knight h5, and if you move the rook back, then there is a big attack coming for black. In fact, in this position, immediately there's just rook f2, and the game is over. You're just getting checkmated. There's nothing you can do. And if rook g2, which is a tougher defense, knight f4. Attacking here. If you go back to g1, just the same basically. Just take on e2 first, and then rook f2, and the game ends. And if you go rook g3 instead, then even knight h3 is enough. This is a big attack. This is very, very hard to defend for white. So okay, what are we seeing here after knight h5? And my opponent played queen g1, which we'll analyse in a minute, but I just want to take a minute to just take stock of what we've just seen. So what we saw was basically a white player, a very committal move early on, a committal pawn break g4. And we saw an incorrect reaction from black, playing f5 anyway. And actually, all the play stemming from the play of g4, and also from what should have stemmed from the incorrect break f5, comes from some consideration of what weaknesses. So from g4, f4, and f4 and h4, and from f5 the g file. what weaknesses were left behind by the pawn breaks, and you need to consider that all the time, basically, especially in these kind of closed positions, because they're infiltration squares, they're outpost squares for the opponent's pieces. We're seeing the queen is standing on h4, and the knight is about to come into the other one to f4. So, some of the weaknesses here are really, really important, left behind by g4. The other thing to consider is that the standard plan, actually, although it appears to be working out for black now, of playing f5 doesn't really work after the opponent plays g4, which is not really a standard move. But the computer, as esoteric as it is, came up with a pretty good alternate plan of moving the king out the way, moving the rook to the h file, and trying to attack down here. So, while I said I don't really understand the computer line, and I don't, it's pretty slow, but at the end of the day, it's a close position. So I guess the other thing to bear in mind from that, at least, is to don't be afraid to change plans from the usual, particularly if your opponent's play means the usual plan appears to not be very good. But anyway, back to the game. So, the two things there, but my opponent played queen g1, just giving the exchange, and I said thank you very much. You can kind of see why he did this. We analysed the rook moves, and all of them look killing, basically. So I just took the exchange here. My opponent played f takes g3. Obviously h takes g3 is not possible because the pawn is pinned, and queen takes g3 would just give the exchange and an exchange of queens to black, as well as presumably rook f2 coming after that. So yeah, this is potentially the only reasonable recapture. I went all the way back to e7. I'm attacking the knight on c5. I am not threatening to take this just yet, but it does tie the queen down to the defense of the knight, and that is valuable in itself. My opponent played rook d1. Okay, not the most active square for the rook, but really, where are you going to put it? The only open file is the f file. Black has control of that, and you're down materials, so you don't want to offer an exchange. So okay, rook d1, and I played b6, booting the knight out. Knight d3. And now h5, just solidifying my pawn here, before white decides they can gang up on this somehow. Actually the rook d1 move is probably not so conducive to this. Queen d1 would be a good way to do that, but maybe h3, and just avoiding any complication. I'm up a clean exchange, and now I'll just develop everything, activate my pieces, and try and win the game from here. So my opponent played knight b4. I played bishop b7. Just preventing the knight coming into c6. If he does come into c6, I will just take it and ruin the structure. In many ways, I'll isolate this pawn. Okay, I'll give black the open d file, I'll put up an exchange, and with a better pawn structure, that shouldn't be a problem. And now we have knight to b1 by white, and we see here kind of an exchange where black has a plan, but to be honest with you, I'm not really sure what white is doing, because white's plan appears to be to play knight c3, knight b5, and start attacking black's queenside pawns. And this, you'll see in the game, this is what happens. But really, it's so slow that in the meantime, black's just going to gang up on the f file, play bishop h6, and activate all the pieces and infiltrate on f2, and say, I don't really care about this. This is really slow. And actually, we kind of see that that's exactly what happens. So rook f6, trying to double, knight c3, rook a to f8, as promised, queen to e3, and now king h7. I basically queen e3 looks like it prevents bishop h6, so I just wanted to play this to try and get the bishop active, but it also means that bishop h6 will come with a tempo now. Okay, queen d3, moving out of the attack, and rook f2, infiltrating. And if we compare this to just a few moves ago when white embarked on this knight b4, knight b1, knight c3 stuff, white has kind of done nothing, and black has made loads of progress and infiltrated the white position. So what I'm kind of saying here is white is, I guess, playing with the plan, but the plan is so slow that it doesn't really do anything, while black has done something very, very concrete here and will soon crash through, as we'll see in the game. So my kind of third point was, you must have a plan, and it has to be a plan that does something. It can't be a plan that does something in 20 moves. It's going to be way too slow, like almost regardless of the position. You must have an active plan right now. And you can't do it if you have a plan, it takes 15 moves, and in the meantime your opponent lands a rook on f2, then it's probably not a very good plan. And this, you have to kind of react to your opponent's things as well, I guess, is the extension of this. So we'll see over the next few moves. Knight b5, bishop h6, activating the bishop as promised earlier. Now, as I mentioned, this bishop has no opponent. It rules this diagonal. And really, just look at black's pieces compared to white's pieces. Which one of white's pieces is really doing anything? Well, black's only really bad piece is the bishop on b7, and actually even that's doing a pretty good job of restricting this knight. So, yeah, black is completely dominating here, and up the exchange. I have knight a7. I'm trying to come into c6 so that if I capture you, recapture with the knight. But again, this knight will just, even if I just put in a null move, even if I just say, okay, your turn again, you play knight c6. I ask like white, what is he doing? So I get rid of my worst piece and I play queen f6, and I say all my pieces look so much better than all your pieces. I've just traded my worst piece for a piece that you took like how many tempi to get here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you traded it off for my worst piece. White's plan is not an active plan. This is what I mean by you must have a plan. It might seem quite harsh, but at the end of the day, White didn't have a plan. White accomplished nothing, and probably gets punished. At the end of the game, end of the game is coming very quickly. There's a rook on f2, h4 was played by me, and after knight c6, I took, you took, and I played queen g5, just essentially waiting to come and kill the king. And after a few short moves later, that's exactly what happened. So I won't give any more detail. I think I've made my point. But the final few moves of the game will suffice to show the ending. So rook g1, take on g3, rook g3, queen h4, attacking h2. Very, very hard to defend this now. Rook g2, just take on g2, and then rook f2, and my opponent resigned. Checkmate is coming very shortly. So yeah, not to labour the point more than necessary, but this essentially all came from White's passive play after they dropped the exchange, and it made it very, very easy for Black to win the game. So I finished the tournament on 4 out of 5 points, and the burning question: was it enough to win the tournament? No, it was not. One player ended with a perfect score, a 5 out of 5, and 2 with 4.5 out of 5. So not even a podium finish, so to speak. No prizes for me. But some very enjoyable games, and hopefully learn something for next time. I will play a very similar tournament, also hosted by the 4NCL next weekend. We'll go through the games on the channel shortly after the tournament again. In the meantime, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you again in the next one.